Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling two really fascinating, maybe even controversial subjects from the Bible.
Yeah, we're looking at the historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth and then that enduring mystery, the Ark of the Covenant.
Exactly. These are, huge figures in religious tradition, obviously, but today we're putting on our, let's say, historical detective hats.
That's the plan. We want to see what history, using texts, archaeology, inscriptions, that kind of thing can actually tell us.
Trying to separate verifiable historical claims from faith-based beliefs, which isn't always easy with these topics.
No, it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
They're so deeply woven into tradition and belief. You have to think about how that might have shaped the evidence itself or even how we look at it.
Right, like our own assumptions matter, don't they?
They really do. Take dating the Gospels. A classic example is Jesus' prophecy about the temple's destruction.
Ah.
If a scholar believes prophecy is impossible, they'll almost certainly date the Gospel containing it after 70 CE, when the temple actually fell. If they believe it's possible, they might accept an earlier date.
So our starting points can, really influence our conclusions. Okay.
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind.
All right, so we've got a plan. First up, we're diving into the historical evidence for Jesus.
And then after that, we'll switch gears to the Ark of the Covenant.
Sounds good. Let's start with Jesus. Beyond the New Testament itself, what kind of external evidence do historians look at?
Well, there are some really key mentions from Roman and Jewish writers, mostly late 1st, early 2nd century. Probably the most famous is Cornelius Tacitus.
The Roman historian.
Exactly. Writing around, say, 116 CE. In his annals, he mentions a Christus, that's Christ, who suffered the, quote, extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was emperor.
Okay, wow.
And he also notes there were Christians in Rome back in 64 CE during Nero's persecution.
And Tacitus wasn't exactly friendly towards Christians, was he?
No, not at all. Which, in a way, makes his testimony more compelling for historians. He had no reason to invent this figure. Plus, he was a high-ranking official, likely had access to records.
Right, he was proconsul of Asia, wasn't he? So he might have seen official reports or something.
It's certainly plausible. It gives that reference some real-weight, independent confirmation from a non-Christian, potentially well-informed source.
Okay, who else? Josephus is another name that always comes up.
Yes, Flavius Josephus. A Jewish historian, writing a bit earlier, around 93-94 CE, he mentions Jesus twice.
Right. The first one is the Testimonium Flavianum, isn't it? Which is a bit controversial.
It is, yeah. Very controversial. The scholarly consensus now is that the passage as we have it has definitely been touched up by later Christian scribes.
Yeah.
Added bits to make Jesus sound more explicitly divine.
Okay.
But most scholars think there's an authentic core underneath those additions.
Like what? What's the core bit?
Probably something like,
Yeah.
there was this wise man, Jesus, a teacher, did surprising things, gathered followers, and was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
So even stripped down, it still confirms his existence and execution.
Exactly. Coming from a first-century Jewish historian, that's still pretty significant.
And the second mention in Josephus?
Yeah, this one's much less debated. Almost everyone accepts it as authentic.
Okay.
When Josephus describes the stoning of James, around 62 CE, he identifies him as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ.
Just like that. Almost matter-of-factly.
Pretty much. It suggests Josephus expected his readers to know who this Jesus was. Another non-Christian data point confirming Jesus and his C-mist title.
Okay, so Tacitus and Josephus are pretty solid. Any others?
Yeah, there's Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor in what's now Turkey.
Right.
Around 110-112 CE, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking what to do about Christians. He describes them singing hymns to Christ as to a god.
Wow.
He also mentions their sort of ethical commitments and just how widespread this movement had become. It gives us a window into early Christian practice from an official Roman viewpoint.
That's fascinating. And weren't there some other, maybe less direct references? Suetonius?
Suetonius, another Roman historian, around 121 CE. He mentions Emperor Claudius expelling Jews from Rome because of disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus.
Chrestus. Wow.
Grace, many scholars think so, yeah. Could be a misspelling or confusion, but it points to Christ-related conflict in Rome around 49 CE. He also mentions Nero punishing Christians.
Okay. And Mara Barsarabian.
That's a more obscure one. A Syrian Stoic philosopher writing sometime after 73 CE. In a letter to his son, he compares the unjust deaths of Socrates, Pythagoras, and the wise king of the Jews, noting that the Jews were driven from their kingdom afterwards.
Suggesting Jesus.
It's suggestive, yeah. An indirect reference, perhaps, from an outsider's perspective.
Even hostile sources like the Talmud mention Jesus, right? Though obviously not in a flattering way.
That's right. The Babylonian Talmud contains references to Yeshu, Jesus who practiced sorcery, led Israel astray, and was executed. They're hostile, polemical, but they do acknowledge his existence and execution.
So even his opponents knew he was a real figure.
Seems so. And there are brief possible mentions in other writers, too. Lucian, Epictetus, Galen, little fragments here and there.
Okay, so stepping back from the individual pieces, what's the cumulative picture from all of these non-biblical sources?
Well, the big takeaway is that they collectively paint a pretty consistent picture. They confirm that a man named Jesus, associated with the title Christ, lived in Judea in the early 1st century, gathered followers, caused some disturbance, and was executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and that his followers, Christians, existed and were known in various parts of the Roman Empire within decades of his death.
So they establish his basic historical existence and the start of the movement.
Exactly. They don't prove the theological claims, miracles, resurrection, divinity, but they firmly anchor Jesus in history, independent of the Gospels themselves.
All right, let's turn to the Gospels then. Obviously the main source, but how do historians actually use them? They're not exactly objective news reports.
No, definitely not. That's crucial. They're ancient biographies, called bioi. They aim to persuade, to present Jesus in a certain light as the Messiah, the Son of God. They have a clear theological agenda.
And they were written anonymously at first? The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, John came later.
That's the view of most critical scholars, yes. The traditional attributions came later in the 2nd century.
And the dating. When do scholars think they were actually written?
Well, there's some debate, naturally, but a common view is Mark is the earliest, maybe around 65, 75 CE, perhaps just after the Jewish War and the temple's destruction.
Okay.
Then Matthew and Luke, probably written in the 80s or 90s CE. And John is generally seen as the latest, maybe 90 to 100 CE, possibly even a bit later. John also has a distinct, more developed theological perspective.
And Matthew and Luke seem to have used Mark, right? That's part of the two-source hypothesis.
Exactly. The two-source hypothesis is the dominant explanation for the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels.
Synoptic meaning seeing together.
Right, because they share so much material and can be viewed side by side. The theory goes, Mark was written first. Then Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a major source for their narrative framework.
Okay, that explains the overlap. But what about the stuff Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark, like lots of sayings?
That's where the second source comes in the hypothetical Q source, from the German word Quell, meaning source. Q is thought to have been a collection, probably written mostly of Jesus' sayings and teachings that both Matthew and Luke had access to, independent of Mark.
So Mark provides the story structure, Q provides a lot of the teaching material.
That's the basic idea. Plus, Matthew and Luke also seem to have had their own unique material, sometimes called M and L, respectively.
So they're weaving together different strands of tradition.
Precisely. And Mark himself might have drawn on even earlier traditions, perhaps a narrative about Jesus' final days, the Passion narrative. The point is, the Gospels didn't just appear fully formed. They developed over time, drawing on oral traditions and earlier written collections.
Given that complexity, how do historians try to figure out what might actually go back to Jesus himself versus what might be later interpretation or development?
It's a tough process. Scholars use various criteria of authenticity. They're like historical rules of thumb, not foolproof guarantees.
Okay, like what?
Well, one is multiple attestation. If a saying or story appears in several independent sources, say Mark, Q, maybe Paul's letters, even John, it's more likely to be early and potentially authentic.
Makes sense if different people are reporting the same thing.
Right. Another is the criterion of embarrassment. This looks for material that would have been awkward or problematic for the early church.
Oh, like what? Give me an example.
Like Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Later theology saw Jesus as superior to John, so why invent a story where he submits to John's baptism? The fact that it's there suggests it probably happened. Or maybe the disciples, sometimes looking foolish or misunderstanding Jesus.
Okay. Things they wouldn't likely make up later.
Exactly. Then there's coherence. Does a saying fit with the overall message and context of Jesus' known teaching? And dissimilarity, This one's a bit controversial, but it suggests that if something is distinct from both first-century Judaism and later Christian belief, it might uniquely stem from Jesus.
But you have to use these carefully, I imagine, and account for differences between the Gospels, too.
Absolutely. They're tools, not magic wands. And yes, the discrepancies between the Gospels are also important data. They show different perspectives, maybe different traditions or editorial choices.
Okay, that gives us a way to approach the Gospels critically. Now, what about digging in the ground? Archaeology. Can it tell us anything concrete about Jesus' world?
Archaeology is fantastic for context. Yeah. It rarely gives you direct proof of a specific person like Jesus, especially someone who wasn't, say, a king leaving inscriptions, but it can absolutely illuminate the world described in the Gospels.
Like, does it confirm the places existed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Take Nazareth. For a while, some skeptics questioned if it was even a village in the first century.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. But excavations have shown pretty definitively now that Nazareth in the first century CE was a small Jewish agricultural hamlet. We found remains of simple stone houses, rock-cut tombs, wine presses, pottery, coins, all consistent with the period before 70 CE.
So the kind of place the Gospels describe.
Exactly. There's even a first-century house under the Sisters of Nazareth convent that shows signs of possible early veneration by Christians. Archaeology makes Jesus' hometown tangible.
What about Capernaum? That was sort of his base of operations in Galilee.
Capernaum yields even more. We found the impressive remains of a later synagogue, 4th, 5th century.
Okay.
But crucially, it seems to be built directly over the foundations of a simpler first-century synagogue, likely made of basalt. Possibly the very synagogue where the Gospels say Jesus taught.
Wow.
And nearby, there's a complex of rooms identified by tradition as the House of St. Peter. What's significant is that one room was singled out for special attention very early on, plastered differently, fewer domestic items, lots of fishhooks, and eventually a church was built right over it.
Suggesting early Christians venerated that spot.
It strongly suggests that yes, again, context and plausibility.
Okay, moving down to Jerusalem, the Passion events. What can archaeology tell us there?
Well, the exact location of the Praetorium where Pilate tried Jesus is still debated. Was it the Antonia Fortress near the Temple Mount, or Herod the Great's palace on the western side of the city? Archaeology offers clues related to both.
What about the pavement, Gabbatha?
There's a large stone pavement beneath the convent of the Sisters of Zion, near the Antonia Fortress site, that was traditionally identified as Gabbatha. However, much of that pavement seems to date later to the 2nd century CE. So the identification is uncertain.
But we do have direct proof of Pilate himself, don't we?
We do. That's a key find. The Pilate stone, discovered at Caesarea Maritima, the Roman administrative capital. It's an inscription dedicated by Pontius Pilate, identifying him as the prefect of Judea. Concrete proof he held that office.
That's huge. What about the crucifixion site itself? Golgotha and the tomb, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
The traditional site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, actually holds up quite well archaeologically. Investigations show that in the early 1st century, this area was outside the city walls.
Which fits the gospel accounts.
Exactly. It was an abandoned stone quarry and was used as a burial ground, with rock-cut tombs typical of the period. One of these tombs, enclosed within the church, is venerated as Jesus' tomb.
And there's evidence of a garden.
Recent archaeobotanical analysis found pollen and seed remains, suggesting it might have been a garden or agricultural area in the 1st century. So the setting aligns remarkably well with the Gospels.
How does that compare to the garden tomb, the other site some people favor?
The garden tomb, while a beautiful and evocative place, doesn't have the same archaeological support. The tomb there appears to be from an earlier period, likely the Iron Age, centuries before Jesus. And its location relative to the 1st century city walls is less certain. Most archaeologists favor the Holy Sepulchre site based on the evidence.
So summing up the archaeology,
it provides a plausible, historically coherent context. It confirms the places, the culture, the practices described in the Gospels. It doesn't prove Jesus performed miracles or rose from the dead, but it makes the narrative setting real and understandable. It grounds the story in a specific time and place.
Okay, we've looked at external sources, the Gospels themselves, the physical setting. Let's try to piece together a historical picture of Jesus' life based on what scholars generally agree on, starting with his birth.
Yeah, the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, the virgin birth, Bethlehem, the Magi, the shepherds, most critical scholars, see these primarily as theological narratives.
Meaning
they were likely crafted later to make specific theological points about Jesus' identity and significance, drawing on Old Testament prophecies and motifs. They aren't necessarily straightforward historical accounts.
And Mark and John don't even have birth stories.
Right. And Paul, our earliest Christian writer, never mentions a virgin birth or Bethlehem. So from a purely historical standpoint, stripped of the theological layers, most scholars would say Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, his known hometown.
Okay, what about his ministry? What's the consensus there?
There's very broad agreement that Jesus was a real historical figure, a Jewish teacher and preacher active in Galilee and Judea in the late 20s CE.
For how long?
Probably a relatively short period, maybe 1 year, maybe up to 3. He gathered disciples, both men and women, and his central message seems to have revolved around the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God.
An apocalyptic preacher, then, expecting God to intervene dramatically.
That's a very common understanding, yes.
Yeah.
He operated within that first-century Jewish apocalyptic worldview, anticipating a major divine intervention to establish God's rule.
And his teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables.
They fit within that framework. Radical calls for repentance, absolute trust in God, love for God and neighbor, even enemies' forgiveness, a reinterpretation of the Mosaic law focusing on inner intention. Think of the Sermon on the Mount probably as a collection of key teachings, maybe not delivered all at once.
Okay, now the miracles. Always a point of contention. How do historians handle those accounts?
Well, historians using standard historical methods generally can't verify supernatural events. Methodological naturalism,
Right.
But what historians can say is that Jesus was widely perceived as a healer and exorcist. This is strongly attested in multiple independent gospel sources, that criterion of multiple attestation. And it even passes the criterion of embarrassment, like the accusations that he used demonic power, Beelzebul, to cast out demons. The early church wouldn't likely invent that.
So whether you believe the miracles were supernatural or not, his reputation as a miracle worker seems historically grounded.
Yes, that seems very likely. He was seen as a charismatic figure with extraordinary power by many who encountered him.
And then the crucifixion. This seems like one of the most certain facts.
Absolutely. It's almost universally accepted by historians of all stripes, Christian, Jewish, secular. It's multiply attested in the Gospels, Paul's letters, Tacitus, Josephus. It's about as historically certain as anything from the ancient world can be.
And it was a Roman execution.
Yes. Crucifixion was a brutal Roman punishment, typically used for slaves, rebels, and non-citizens convicted of serious crimes, especially sedition.
The Gospels also implicate Jewish authorities. How do scholars see their role?
It's complex. The Gospels portray certain Jewish leaders, particularly the temple authorities in Jerusalem, as playing a key role in Jesus' arrest and handing him over to Pilate. Their motivations likely involve his challenges to their authority, perhaps his actions in the temple, maybe fears he could provoke a Roman crackdown or charges of blasphemy.
But the final decision was Roman.
Unquestionably. Only the Roman governor had the authority to impose the death penalty in Judea at that time. The charge Pilate executed him on seems to have been sedition, the claim, or perceived claim, to be king of the Jews, which Rome would see as rebellion.
And that apocalyptic kingdom of God message ties into why he was seen as a threat.
It really does. Proclaiming an imminent new kingdom, even a divine one, could easily be interpreted by both the ruling Jewish elite and the Roman occupiers as politically dangerous, a challenge to the existing order. It helps explain why he ended up on a cross.
Okay. That leads us inevitably to the resurrection, foundational for Christianity, but how does history approach it?
Yeah, this is where history as a discipline kind of hits its limits regarding the core Christian claim. The resurrection itself, a supernatural event, is inherently beyond empirical historical proof or disproof. It's a matter of faith.
So what can historians study?
Historians can study the belief in the resurrection among Jesus' earliest followers and the impact of that belief. That's historically undeniable. Something happened after Jesus' death that transformed his demoralized disciples into bold proclaimers of his resurrection.
What about the empty tomb stories?
They're part of the tradition found in all four Gospels. Arguments for their historicity often point to their early attestation, the surprising role of women as the first witnesses, which seems unlikely to be invented in that patriarchal culture, and the fact that the movement started in Jerusalem, where the tomb could theoretically have been checked.
And arguments against?
Arguments against include Paul's apparent silence about an empty tomb in his earliest list of resurrection appearances, 1 Corinthians 15, the possibility Jesus didn't receive a proper burial initially, allowing the tomb location to be lost or confused, and of course the discrepancies between the gospel accounts themselves. Scholars like William Lane Craig argue strongly for it. Others like Bart Ehrman or John Dominic Crossan are more skeptical.
And the appearances? Paul lists them, the Gospels describe them.
Yes, Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 is very early, probably drawing on a creed that dates to within just a few years of Jesus' death. He mentions appearances to Peter, the 12, more than 500 brothers at once, James, Jesus' brother, who wasn't a follower during his lifetime, all the apostles, and finally to Paul himself. The Gospels add narrative details.
What supports the idea these were real experiences?
The arguments often center on the earliness of the reports, the dramatic transformation of the disciples from frightened individuals to people willing to suffer and die for their belief, and the unlikely conversions of James and Paul, who were initially skeptical or hostile.
And the counter-arguments.
Skeptical explanations often involve psychological phenomena, grief-induced visions, hallucinations, cognitive dissonance. They might point out that we can't corroborate the appearance to 500, and that people certainly die for beliefs that turn out not to be factually true, even if sincerely held.
There's something called the minimal facts approach, right? What's that?
Yeah, that's an approach favored by some apologists, like Gary Habermas. It tries to build a case based only on facts that enjoy near universal scholarly consensus, even among skeptics.
Like what?
Typically, Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples sincerely believed they saw him alive afterwards. Their lives were transformed by this belief. James, his skeptical brother, converted after believing he saw the risen Jesus. And Paul, the persecutor, also converted based on a similar experience.
But even accepting those facts doesn't force a historian to accept a supernatural explanation.
Exactly. A critical historian might accept those minimal facts as historical data, but still argue for a naturalistic explanation for the disciples' beliefs and experiences, rather than concluding the resurrection literally happened. The transformative experiences are historically significant for explaining Christianity's rise, but the cause remains debated.
Okay, so to wrap up the Jesus part, what's the bottom line? What can we say with reasonable historical confidence?
We can be very confident that Jesus existed, was a Jewish teacher in first century Palestine, was baptized by John, taught about the kingdom of God, gathered disciples, performed actions perceived as healings or exorcisms, had conflicts with authorities, and was crucified by the Romans under Pilate.
An area is still debated.
Oh, plenty. His exact self-understanding, did he think he was divine? The precise nature of his apocalyptic message, the historicity of specific miracles, the details surrounding his birth, the nature of the post-crucifixion experiences, the exact interplay of Jewish and Roman factors in his death. These are all areas of ongoing research and debate.
This whole effort is sometimes called the quest for the historical Jesus, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the term for the scholarly attempt to distinguish the Jesus of history, the man who lived in first century Galilee, from the Christ of faith, the figure worshipped by the church. It's about using historical methods to understand him as best we can.
So history gives us a plausible, significant figure, but faith fills in other aspects.
That's a good way to put it. Historical evidence allows for a robust reconstruction of Jesus' life and impact. But many core tenets of Christian belief remain, ultimately, matters of faith beyond historical proof.
Okay, wow. That was a serious deep dive into Jesus. Let's take a breath and switch gears to our second enigma, the Ark of the Covenant.
Right. Equally fascinating, equally mysterious in its own way.
So, starting with the Bible again, what do the texts actually say the Ark was? How was it made? What was inside?
Well, the most detailed instructions for building it are in the book of Exodus, in passages often associated with the priestly source, likely written later, during or after the exile.
Okay.
It describes this portable chest, made of acacia wood, completely overlaid with gold, inside and out. It had gold rings on the corners and gold-covered poles slipped through them for carrying, so it wouldn't be touched directly.
And the lid,
Right.
famous part.
Yes. The lid was called a capare, usually translated mercy seat. It was made of solid gold, and on top were two golden cherubim facing each other, with their wings stretching out over the mercy seat. God was said to speak from between the cherubim.
Cherubim like angels or something else.
Probably more like sphinx-like guardian figures, common imagery in the ancient Near East associated with thrones and sacred spaces, not chubby babies.
Right, okay. What about the contents? Just the 10 Commandments?
Well, primarily, yes. Exodus and Deuteronomy both emphasize it held the stone tablets of the law, the testimony. That's its core function container for the covenant documents.
But I thought it had other stuff too. Manna, Aaron's rod.
That's a later tradition. The New Testament book of Hebrews mentions those items being inside, and some rabbinic traditions agree. But an earlier text, 1 Kings 8, states specifically that when Solomon placed the ark in the temple, there was nothing in it except the 2 stone tablets.
Interesting. So even the Bible has slightly different takes on the contents over time.
It seems so. The core, consistent element is the tablets of the law.
And what role did the ark play in the Old Testament stories?
Oh, a huge role. It was the primary symbol of God's presence, his Shekinah or glory dwelling among the Israelites. It represented the covenant. It also functioned as a kind of war palladium.
A war palladium, like it helped them win battle.
That was the belief, yes. Think of the stories of crossing the Jordan River, the waters parted, when the priests carrying the ark stepped in. Or the fall of Jericho, they carried the ark around the city. It was seen as bringing God's power onto the battlefield. Though sometimes, like when the Siftings captured it, that didn't quite work out as planned.
Right. Where was it kept?
Initially in the tabernacle, during the wilderness wanderings. Then for a long time at Shiloh. After being captured and returned by the Philistines, it ended up at Kiriath Jearim for a while. Then King David famously brought it to Jerusalem with great celebration.
That was a big deal, right? Bringing it to his new capital.
A huge political and religious statement, yes. Centralizing worship and linking his dynasty with God's presence. Finally, Solomon installed it in the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the temple he built.
And after that, when is the last time it's mentioned?
The last clear, explicit mention is during the reign of King Josiah in 2 Chronicles 35, around the late 7th century BCE. Josiah tells the Levites to return the ark to the temple.
And then, silence.
Pretty much. It's not mentioned during the accounts of the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BCE, nor in the lists of temple treasures taken to Babylon or later returned. That silence is the heart of the mystery.
Okay, before we get into the what happened theories, let's put the ark in its wider neighborhood, ancient Near East. Were there things like it in other cultures?
Absolutely. The idea of a portable sacred container wasn't unique to Israel. We see lots of parallels.
Like in Egypt.
Egypt is a great example. They had sacred barks or chests, often carried on poles in processions, ornately decorated, sometimes overlaid with gold. They were thought to house the deity's presence or contain sacred objects. Think of the Anubis shrine found in Tutankhamun's tomb, a gilded chest on poles with a statue. Some depictions show winged figures, reminiscent of the cherubim, protecting these sacred objects.
Okay, so the portability, the poles, the gold, even protective figures. Those are common themes.
Yes. Also in Mesopotamia, cult statues were sometimes carried in processions or even into battle. Portable shrines existed.
Right.
In Levant, closer to Israel, we find evidence for portable cult stands and boxes. The cherubim throne imagery itself, a deity seated invisibly or visibly on a throne flanked by winged guardians, is widespread royal and divine iconography in the region.
So the ark fits into that general cultural world?
It does. It seems likely the Israelites adapted existing forms and symbols common in the ancient Near East.
But what made the Israelite ark different?
The key difference, especially as Israelite theology developed, was its radical aniconism. Unlike Egyptian sacred barks carrying an idol or Mesopotamian statues, the ark contained the law, the covenant documents. The space between the cherubim on the mercy seat was understood as the focal point of God's invisible presence, his throne, but an empty one.
An empty throne.
Right. This emphasis on aniconism, no physical image of Yahweh, became a defining feature of Israelite religion, setting it apart. Some scholars talk about Israel's unique empty space aniconism. So while the form had parallels, the theology it represented became distinct.
We talked about source criticism with the Gospels. Does that apply to the ark narratives too, different layers of writing?
Very much so. As I mentioned, the detailed descriptions in Exodus are often assigned to the priestly source, likely dating to the exilic or post-exilic period.
After the ark was already gone.
Probably, yes. So P's description might be an idealized, perhaps even exaggerated memory or theological construction of what the ark should have been like, emphasizing ritual purity and God's transcendent glory, Shekinah. P also tends to call it the Ark of the Testimony, focusing on the tablets inside, maybe downplaying its earlier, cruder role as a war palladium.
Okay, what about the stories in Joshua, Samuel, Kings?
Those books are largely shaped by the Deuteronomistic history, DH, another major literary stratum. DH uses the Ark stories to promote its own theological agenda, the importance of covenant loyalty, divine reward and punishment, the legitimacy of the Davidic monarchy, and especially the centralization of worship in Jerusalem.
So David bringing the ark to Jerusalem is a key DH narrative.
Absolutely. It legitimizes both David and Jerusalem. The ark leading the conquest in Joshua reinforces God's power and promise.
So different writers use the ark story for different purposes.
Exactly. And some scholars, like Thomas Romer or Kyle Sparks, argue the whole concept of the ark probably evolved. Maybe it started as something simpler, a container for sacred stones, a tribal war standard, maybe even originally from the northern kingdom and only later brought to Judah. The elaborate P description might be a much later development. Even the different construction accounts, Exodus versus Deuteronomy, could reflect different stages or traditions.
So the ark in the Bible might be a composite picture built up over centuries.
That's a strong possibility. It makes disentangling the original historical object from its later literary and theological portrayals very difficult. It was clearly a potent symbol that could be adapted and redeployed.
Which brings us back to archaeology. If the biblical descriptions might be later idealizations and the original might have been simpler, have we found anything that could be related?
Well, as we said, no ark itself. The focus is on associated sites. Shiloh, as mentioned, fits the bill as an early Israelite cult site that was destroyed, consistent with the narrative. Kiriath Jearim, where the ark supposedly rested for years before David, has that large Iron Age two-in platform. But Finkelstein and Romer argue it's maybe 8th century BCE, potentially a northern kingdom administrative or cultic center after the time the Bible says the ark was there. So the connection is debated.
And the Temple Mount, where it supposedly ended up.
That's the most tantalizing and frustrating location. Excavation is extremely limited. Lean Rittmeyer's theory about a bedrock cutting matching the ark's dimensions under the dome of the rock is intriguing but speculative.
And the stories about it being hidden in tunnels there.
Those are strong in Jewish tradition, attributed to Solomon or Josiah preparing for invasion. There was that brief, controversial rabbinical tunnel excavation in 1981 near the Western Wall, quickly halted by authorities, but no confirmed discovery.
So why the lack of direct evidence, if it was so important?
Several reasons. If it was mostly wood, it just might not have survived. If it was captured or destroyed by the Babylonians, it's gone. If it was hidden, it was hidden well. And finding one specific object from 2,500, 3,000 years ago is incredibly rare archaeologically. Plus, there's the possibility we discussed that the Grand Ark of Exodus is more of a literary theological construct based on a perhaps simpler original.
So archaeology illuminates the world of the stories, but the ark itself remains elusive.
Exactly. It's the archaeology, the narrative context, not the artifact itself, unlike, say, the Pilate stone.
Okay. The million-dollar question, then. What did happen to it? What are the main theories?
Given the biblical silence after Josiah and its absence from lists of loot, the most historically straightforward explanation for many scholars is destruction or capture by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. It was gold-covered, symbolic prime loot.
Makes sense. Brutally.
But that's not the only possibility. The strong Jewish tradition is that it was hidden, secreted away before the Babylonians arrived. Most traditions point to beneath the Temple Mount itself, in secret chambers. Maimonides discusses this. Then there's the account in 2 Maccabees, an apocryphal book claiming the prophet Jeremiah hid it, along with the tabernacle and altar of incense, in a cave on Mount Nebo, in modern Jordan, sealing the entrance and saying it won't be found until God gathers his people again.
Mount Nebo, where Moses saw the promised land. Symbolic.
Very. There are other, less common theories, like maybe it was taken much earlier by the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak during his campaign mentioned in 1 Kings. Most scholars doubt this, as Shishak's own records don't mention it.
Okay, those are the more, let's say, historically plausible or traditional theories. What about the more out-there claims? Ethiopia.
Ah, yes. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's claim is probably the most famous. They believe they have the Ark, housed in a special chapel next to the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Axum.
Guarded by one monk who never leaves.
Supposedly. Their national epic, the Keber Negast, tells how Menelik I, son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba brought it from Jerusalem to Ethiopia.
What do scholars make of that?
Intense skepticism, generally. No one unaffiliated has been allowed to examine the object. The late scholar Edward Uhlendorf, who did see the inside of the chapel decades ago, suspected it contained only a medieval replica box. There's no external evidence to support the claim, compelling as the story is.
Any other claimants? The Lemba people?
Yes, the Lumba people of southern Africa have traditions connecting them to ancient Israel and possess a sacred drum-like object called the Ngoma Lungundu, which they associate with the Ark. A replica is in a museum in Harare. Again, fascinating tradition, but no verifiable link to the biblical ark.
And then you get into Knights Templar theories, Ireland, Zimbabwe.
Right, those tend to fall more into the realm of popular legends and fringe theories, often fueled by wishful thinking or sensationalism without credible historical backing.
Even Islam has traditions about a sacred chest, right?
Right.
The tabut.
Yes, the Quran mentions the Tabut as-Sakina, the Ark of the Covenant or Ark of the Presence, containing Sakina, divine tranquility or presence, and relics of Moses and Aaron. It's presented as a sign of divinely appointed kingship for Saul. Talut. Traditions vary, but often link its loss to Nebuchadnezzar. Some Shia traditions expect the Mahdi to retrieve it at the end times.
It's incredible how these legends persist and adapt across cultures.
It really shows the Ark's immense symbolic power. Its loss left a vacuum, a sense of incompletion that these stories try to fill. They reflect a deep longing for tangible connection to divine presence and power, or hopes for future restoration.
Even Jeremiah prophesied a time when it wouldn't be needed anymore.
Right. Jeremiah 3.16 looks forward to a time when people won't talk about the Ark or miss it because Jerusalem itself will be called the throne of the Lord, a shift away from the physical object. But until then, its absence looms large. And popular culture, like Indiana Jones, just keeps that fascination alive.
So let's refocus on its original significance in ancient Israel. What did it fundamentally represent?
It was multivalent. First, the locus of God's special presence, the meeting point between heaven and earth, between the cherubim. Second, the physical embodiment of the covenant holding the law. Third, a symbol of God's divine kingship, his invisible throne. Fourth, its presence in Jerusalem centralized the national cult. Fifth, it was key in developing Israel's aniconic tradition. And sixth, it was a powerful tool for nation building and identity, a shared symbol of divine guidance, protection, and law.
Given all that, its absence in the Second Temple must have been profound.
Huge. Josephus and Tacitus both confirm the Holy of Holies was emptied by the 1st century CE.
How did Judaism adapt?
It required major theological shifts.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, Jeremiah's prophecy pointed towards Jerusalem itself, or God's universal presence. Ezekiel's visions offered a new image of God's glory, the Merkabah or chariot throne, not tied to the ark. There was a growing emphasis on the Torah scroll itself as the embodiment of God's word, on prayer, and on the synagogue as a place of meeting, study.
So the temple was still considered valid without it.
Yes. The rituals, like the high priest entering the empty Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, continued. The absence might have been seen by some as a diminished glory, but perhaps also emphasized God's transcendence. He couldn't be contained in a box. Priestly theology already had concepts of God's kavod, glory, and anon, cloud, that could manifest without the ark itself.
But the hope for its return persisted.
It did, often linked to messianic expectations, the idea that the Messiah would restore the temple and its furnishings, including the ark.
It's almost paradoxical the loss of the ark might have helped Judaism survive.
In a way, yes. It forced a move towards a more abstract, portable, text-centered form of worship that proved incredibly resilient, especially after the Second Temple's destruction in 70 CE. The focus shifted from a physical object in one location to the study and practice of Torah everywhere.
Okay, so summing up the ark, how do we balance history, theology, legend?
It's a complex mix. Historically, an ark-like object fits the ancient Near Eastern context. Archaeologically, we have context, but no direct proof of the specific biblical ark. Theologically and literarily, it's clear the ark's story and description evolved over time, shaped by different sources like P and DH, to convey profound ideas about God's presence, covenant, and kingship.
So, likely a real historical core.
Probably. A historical memory of a sacred chest, maybe simpler than the Exodus description, that became layered with theological meaning and idealization, and ultimately fueled centuries of legend after its disappearance. Distinguishing those layers is the ongoing challenge.
It really strikes me how different the evidence is for these two subjects. For Jesus, it's primarily textual gospels, Paul, non-biblical writers with archaeology providing context.
Right. For the ark, the primary biblical texts describing it in detail are likely quite late, written long after it vanished. The earlier narratives embedded in stories, and the archaeology is even more indirect, focusing on places it might have been.
And both force us to think about how history, textual analysis, and faith interact. Where do we draw the lines?
Exactly. It highlights the need to be clear about methodology. What can historical inquiry reasonably tell us, based on evidence, and what falls into the realm of theological interpretation or faith affirmation? They're related, but distinct ways of knowing.
Yet, despite all the historical uncertainties and debates, the impact of both Jesus and the Ark is just undeniable. They've shaped civilizations.
Profoundly. Their significance transcends the historical puzzles. They continue to resonate culturally, religiously, ethically.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. How does this lack of definitive physical proof for things that are so incredibly significant historically, religiously affect belief? How does it affect interpretation, both within traditions and for you personally?
Yeah, what does it mean when faith and history intersect like this? When the evidence is partial or ambiguous? Where do you draw the line between historical reconstruction and personal belief when you try to understand the past and how it shapes who we are today?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.